This is a sad day today for the world of chess, as it has become known that the great Bent Larsen has died today. Um, and it's quite a coincidence because just a week ago I was looking at one of his games, so I thought it's only appropriate to make a video of that game because I was really impressed by that game. Um, this is a game Robic versus Larsen from 1963. And in this game, Black showed the typical ideas um, for the pawn structure, which later became typical for the Sveshnikov variation of the Sicilian defense. So let's have a look at the game. Larsen was playing with the black pieces, and in the Sicilian defense, Black played e5, which creates a weakness on d5, but Black hopes to create counterplay to compensate for that. And after the logical moves, we got this position. Now, normally these days, Black here plays b5, which leads to the Sveshnikov variation, and the idea of that line is to prevent this knight from coming back into the center, and then later maybe moving to e3 to control d5 better. So it's probably the most popular line now, to play b5. In this game, Larsen, however, played bishop to e6. It's a developing move. It's also potentially eyeing the c4 square, but with a bishop. And it's also preparing the development of the rook to c8, and then later maybe knight to d4. So Black will also try to challenge the c4 square, but with the pieces instead of pawns. And he also, for the time being, avoids b5, which may be creating a target for the white pieces. So anyway, he played bishop to e6. White immediately tried to bring the knight to the center, and Black created pressure with rook c8. These days the most popular move is to capture immediately on f6 and then to play knight to d5. Instead, first White in this game White played knight to d5. Black captured with the bishop, and here White has a very important decision to make. Well, after he first exchanged on f6, he has an important decision to make. He can take with a pawn or with a queen. He really has to capture back. So in the game he took with a pawn, and that became known as a mistake, because the pawn became a weakness, and it allowed Black to have a strong center. Instead, he should have taken with the queen, and of course it looks a bit scary because Black has a couple of ways to attack the queen, and there's this annoying pressure on the c-file, but this now has become the main line, and play can continue along the lines of knight to b4, queen has to retreat, and guard c2, and then d5. This is one of Black's typical ideas in this line, to open up the bishop as soon as possible, and then say maybe takes, and then here Black could capture back on d5, or he could even go crazy with knight to c2 check, and play here becomes pretty complicated and sharp. But this is still White's best chance, because if no complications follow, then White just has a very good outpost on d5. So in the long term, the structure is better for White. So in the game he got a bit scared of the immediate complications and went e takes d5, but now Black has very solid pawn center, and now it's fairly clear that he will soon play something like pawn to f5. So the next move that White played is also a mistake. He played bishop to d3 and then just encourages f5. He should have maybe played bishop e2. Another line that became popular now is queen to f3. That's also possible, and then play can also get pretty complicated here. After bishop to d3, Black played f5, and these pawns will become a permanent strength for black. White castled. Black also prepared development of his king side. Now, white has to challenge these pawns somehow, and he also has to worry about the defense of this pawn on d5. Right now, it's not. It's a little bit dangerous for black to capture it, because if the bishop retreats, I'll say if if knight here, that's just too dangerous. Takes, and takes. So he can't really do this yet. But in the long run, d5 will definitely become a target, and he may even attack it with rook to c5. For the time being, white has to worry about the pawn on d5, and he also has to worry about the strong center that black has. So he has to try to undermine it somehow. In the game, he tried to play queen h5 and put the pressure on the f pawn, and this backfired. But it's also possible that there may have been no better way to go around this. So it's hard to criticize queen to h5. So f5 is attacked, and of course there's two ways of dealing with this. He could advance the f pawn or the e pawn. If he advances the f pawn, that wouldn't make much sense, because then that would just activate this bishop. Yes, he can later play f5, but even right now it doesn't make much sense. So instead, of course, he goes pawn to e4. Now the bishop has to retreat, and this already shows that these white pieces don't have too many squares. So he has to retreat to e2, and black castled. The bishop now is very strong, putting pressure on b2, so white decided to shut down the diagonal with c3, and black just played f4. And now the pawns have advanced further. They can later be supported by this pawn, but this already kind of outlines the plan that black has for the attack. He will play king to h8, bishop to e5, and then he's gonna go for f3 and rook g8, and it's gonna be really hard for white to deal with all this. He tries to pin the knight for now. Now, this is also part of black's strategy. These pieces, again, don't have too many good squares, so black will keep attacking them with the pawns throughout the game. The knight has to retreat. Now the e4 pawn is attacked, so black defends it with f5. White doesn't really have any active play on the king side. If he decides to take the pawn, then the d5 pawn falls with tempo, and after this, again, black will just carry on with bishop to e5 and rook g8. Very difficult position for white. So he tried to undermine these pawns on the queen side here with a4, maybe still trying to get the c4 square for his pieces. But at this point, black just ignores it. His pressure on the king side has become too strong. So he goes king to h8, and he's planning to follow up with rook g8. It's interesting that if white decides to take the pawn, then after f3, again, it's still dangerous to open up the g file and take. So say if white just tries to keep the tension and go bishop c4, then black just transfers pieces to the g file. And it's hard to defend. There's pressure on g2, and if he goes g3, then this, and the white pieces are just hanging. The knight is defending the bishop is attacked by the rook, but now also the knight is being attacked by the bishop, and if the knight moves, the bishop will fall. So black's just winning in a line like this. Instead, he tried to get the knight out of that square immediately, so he went knight to b3, but black just followed up with f3. He just wants to open up the g file. White had to take, and now immediately black exploits the fact that the g file has opened up and the queen and the king are on that file. So he goes bishop takes c3. The bishop has finally come alive. it was shut down behind the pawns on the e5 and f6 squares, but now all these pawns have advanced, and now the bishop is a monster. Of course, he can't take because rook g8 is going to win the queen. So he removes the king from the h-file. The bishop continues grabbing all the pawns on the queen side. So now black's already up a pawn and still has the initiative. And after capturing those pawns, the bishop comes back to e5, and now he's putting pressure on h2. Say if white takes on e4, then black's gonna have threats of transferring the rook to h3, and it's gonna be really hard to oppose this this bishop. Another thing he could have tried to do is try to shut down the diagonal with something like f4, but white's pieces are just very uncoordinated. So then bishop f6 would happen, queen has to move, and then he takes on d5. Now f4 is threatened, so if he tries to take here, then knight b4, and it turns out that again the white pieces are highly discoordinated. The rook is going to soon attack the queen when the bishop moves, and the rook has to go somewhere, and it doesn't have any single good square to move to. If he goes to a dark square, then bishop to b2 is going to win the rook basically, and there's no other better choice, unfortunately. So f4 wasn't very good either. Instead he tried to take on b5, but the rook comes to the g file. Now the knight comes to the center, and now the queen is still being harassed. This is a fork, and for now the queen has to go. The queen has left the h-file, so now the black queen comes to the h-file. And notice how, because they're opposite colored bishops in this position, it's very hard for white to oppose anything on the dark squares. So the black pieces are completely dominating the dark squares, and h2 is where checkmate is probably going to happen. And this bishop has no play whatsoever, so he had to retreat, but the attack against h2 is still deciding the game. If he tries to shut down the file with f4, then just knight to g3 is going to win the queen. So he had to give up the queen, but the game is decided. He took on e2 and immediately resigned. He could have tried to play on, but it's going to be checkmate. So it's quite a massacre. Black just used his pawns to control the center of the board and just developed initiative and attack against the king. It seems like this king is in more danger here because it's on the open file, but because black controls the center, he just moves the king away and attacks on the g file, and there's really nothing white can do. So it's a very impressive game by Larsen, and ideas of attacks like these became typical for the Sveshnikov variation, which became popular only decades later, which is quite interesting indeed.